easier if you keep the first speaking team on your left, because it just follows the progression of the ballot. But it's fine if you keep them this way.
Yeah.
Just make sure you keep your notes and your comments correct.
Okay. Okay. The resolved is the United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. CVU.
All right. Opponents ready? Partner ready? Judge ready? We negate the resolved. The United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. Climate change is a pressing issue that is exacerbated by obscene amounts of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions, and that fact is irrefutable. However, the best solution to mitigating the effects of climate change is not adopting a carbon tax, and my partner and I will prove this to you using three main contentions. Firstly, upon the creation of a carbon tax, large, high CO2 emitting corporations would simply and adeptly find a way to avoid paying such taxes, as they've done so with other corporate taxes, and raise product prices. Secondly, the economic effects of the tax will wreak havoc on the working class. And finally, from an environmental standpoint, imposing a carbon tax won't have the significant impact environmentalists are hoping for. Regarding our first contention, according to U.S. News and World Report, pollution leakage will occur when highly polluting industries simply move to other countries that don't have a comparable limit on pollution. Leakage can also happen if domestic industries shut down, causing us to import goods from other countries. Essentially, implementing a carbon tax won't have the desired effect of making big polluters take accountability and clean up their act. It will just encourage dishonesty, corruption, and will in no way benefit the environment because corporations will just move their operations to places without a tax and continue to pollute the environment. Our second contention extends to reveal that even if big corporations don't avoid the tax, they'll just pass on the cost to consumers, and more specifically, those who can least afford it. According to Resources for the Future, an organization that conducts independent research into environmental issues, a tax on carbon would increase the price of energy, and since low-income households spend a relatively larger share of their household budget on energy, a carbon tax would be regressive in that it would have a larger impact on low-income households. And because energy costs affect prices of every product, the result would be a ripple effect across the economy that would increase the cost of consumer goods for all Americans while simultaneously decreasing the competitiveness of America's global exports. In this aspect, the implementation of a carbon tax would be detrimental to our nation's economy by sending multitudes of working-class Americans below the poverty line because they aren't able to pay their suddenly expensive energy bills. For our final contention, we will address the root of the carbon tax, the supposed environmental benefit that in reality won't have a significant impact in world emissions. According to the Cato Institute, approximately 3 degrees Celsius of global warming that is projected to occur between now and the end of the century as a result of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions, the U.S. contribution will only be about 7% of the total warming. Carbon dioxide emissions from the rest of the world, primarily driven by rapid emissions growth in developing countries like China and India, will be responsible for the other 93% of temperature rise. Since we are discussing a carbon tax solely in the United States, it is clear that even if we do implement a tax, it won't be the magic solution that fixes climate change. Ultimately, it won't make a significant environmental impact. Adding on top of that, historically, carbon taxes haven't had the effects they claimed they would have. According to the New York Times, Norway introduced a carbon tax in 1991 and saw a 43% per capita increase in emissions between then and 2008. Even more recently, according to BBC News, Australia implemented a carbon tax in 2012, only to repeal it 2 years later in 2014 because, as Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott explained, the carbon tax had been, and this is a direct quote, useless and destructive. In conclusion, it is clear that adopting a federal carbon tax would not benefit any aspect of climate change or the economy in any way. In fact, it would be detrimental in both areas. For these reasons, and many more, we strongly urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Judge ready?
Yes.
Opponents ready? Partner ready? Good morning. My partner and I are happy to be here today to debate the following resolution. Resolved, the United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. My partner and I strongly affirm this resolution and support our conviction with the following three contentions. 1, that a carbon tax is the most effective tool we have to combat climate change. 2, that a well-developed carbon tax will benefit the economy, and 3, that a carbon tax would further America's independence from foreign oil. Let me bring your focus to our first contention. Contention 1, that a carbon tax is the most effective tool we have to combat climate change. Now, climate change is devastating, and we are causing it. Extreme coastal floods, hurricanes, heat waves, droughts, this is not a sustainable habit. One of the best examples of man-made CO2 devastation is in the recent and devastating Australian heat waves. Temperatures broke world records for weeks on end, reaching up to around 500 annual deaths, which scientists say could not have happened without man-made CO2. This figure is expected to rise to over 2,000 in the next 50 years. Specifically relating to the United States, Reuters reported that the number of heat-related deaths in the United States is expected to increase to 150,000 by the end of the century. We have a moral obligation to fight climate change, but how can we fight it? Well, the Energy Information Administration estimates that from a carbon tax, carbon dioxide emissions from American power plants would fall to only 419 million tons by 2040, about 1/5 of where they are today. Total carbon dioxide emissions from energy in the United States would fall to less than 3.6 billion tons, 1.8 billion tons less than today. Obviously, a carbon tax is the best option we have. Let me turn to our second contention, that a well-developed carbon tax would benefit the economy. One of the many ways that a carbon tax would help the economy is by advancing green initiatives. Now, data released from the Department of Energy and Climate Change found that 3 to 4 indirect jobs were generated for every person employed directly within the wind industry. As well as spurring green initiatives, a carbon tax increases the economic revenue. The Office of Management and Budget at the White House regarding the budget of the United States government stated that a tax of around $25 per ton of CO2 would raise approximately $1.25 trillion in 1 decade. Not only are most expert economists predicting that a carbon tax would transition us to green energy, we can observe this happening historically. Let me turn you to the example of Sweden. Looking back to 1970, oil accounted to more than 75% of Swedish energy. Today that figure is less than 20%. According to the IEA, Sweden has increased its wind production by 14,000% since 1991. Lastly, let me bring your focus to our final contention, that a carbon tax would further America's independence from foreign oil. Of the oil that the United States imports, 40% comes from OPEC countries. Many Americans are also concerned that oil monies help countries such as Iran pursue activities that are contrary to United States policy. Moreover, we are foolishly relying on limited resources. According to President Barack Obama, we consume more than 20% of the world's oil, but have less than 2% of the world's oil reserves. These resources are limited, and we are taking a major risk by allowing this to continue. The government shouldn't be run like a gambling house. As the junior senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, says, enough is enough. It's time for a political revolution that takes on the fossil fuel billionaires, accelerates our transition to clean energy, and finally puts people before the profits of polluters. For these reasons, we urge you to adopt the resolution.
Thank you.
So in your first contention, you argued that a carbon tax would be an effective tool in the fight against climate change. But as I previously said in my speech, the U.S. is a very small impact in the total global warming that's projected to occur, only
Right.
7%.
Yeah,
and the
only
rest of it is
7%.
coming from developing countries such as China and India. So how can you say that there's going to be that this is the best tool to fight climate change when the U.S. doesn't even have an impact and we can't do this for
Okay,
other
so
countries?
China has just agreed to implement cap and trade.
Yes, but we're not talking about cap and
Firstly,
trade
you just
at
said
all.
you just said China. They're putting efforts against carbon emissions.
But we're talking about
However,
the
we only emit 7%. But the fact is that statistic is rapidly becoming out of date, with more than 40 countries taxing carbon right now, according to the New York Times. So the world is progressing, and we're moving away from carbon dioxide and moving towards green energy, like Sweden is doing right now. 52% of its total energy.
Well,
comes
as
from
I
green
said,
energy.
that it might not spur a change to green energy because of carbon leakage, where companies will just find a different country that doesn't have a comparable limit.
Right, so there are several things. One, we know that most big oil companies like BP and Total Oil support a carbon tax and are ready. They just admitted at the last IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that they want a carbon tax. And putting a
Why
border
would
tax.
a large corporation that
putting up
emits
border
millions
tax.
of tons every year want?
Because when
climate tax?
you switch the revenue generated from carbon tax into green energy, it encourages competition at a whole new market level and increases new jobs, as we've already demonstrated in our speech. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You brought up the example of Norway. And the fact is, Norway has a very weak carbon tax, only taxing 55% of their carbon imports. and they leave most
Yes,
of
so
it.
that shows the example that with the carbon tax, there was an increase, even
No,
with
with
a weak one.
With a poorly formed carbon tax, we're talking about things that could have a dividend, maybe even 100% dividend.
Yes, but actually, I do have a quote for you from the CBO that says when you use the revenues of a carbon tax, there is going to be a lose-lose situation for
Yeah, like any
low
tax,
working
okay?
class.
But it'll generate revenue to spark a new market, green energy.
Actually, I'd like to read this quote too. So, targeting revenues towards people who would be likely to bear a disproportionate burden under a carbon tax
Okay,
by the
it hurts the poor more.
But such a policy would tend to not reduce the total economic cost of the tax. Thus, lawmakers would face a trade-off between the goals of helping those households most hurt by the tax and helping the economy in general.
Right, so do you realize
Lawmakers
for
could
every
use the
gallon?
revenues in more than one way and try to balance those goals. So what you're
Gotcha.
saying here is that if you try to use the revenues to help the economy, you're going to see a very detrimental effect with the working class citizens of this country.
Well, it's
and if
not
you use the revenues to
necessarily.
try to help them, it's going to have detrimental effect on the
Well,
effect
not
on the
necessarily,
economy.
okay?
Actually, it does. It's been proven here.
It hasn't been proven in all cases.
It
The White
has.
House,
This is a-
Representative
an
Larson's
analysis,
bill.
a professional analysis from the Congressional
Okay,
Budget
so
Office.
you're
that
using
has
very
been-
narrow examples of a carbon tax. The fact is, a carbon tax would be anything, any price, any implementation, any gradual curve. So using one specific narrow example to rule out all carbon taxes and regress the future would carbon tax process over.
Thank you.
To begin, I will address our opponents' contentions in the order they were presented. Firstly, our opponents stated that a carbon tax is the most effective tool to combat climate change. However, we have evidence that suggests, quote, approximately 3 degrees Celsius of global warming that is being projected to occur between now and the end of the century as a result of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. The U.S. contribution will only be about 0.2 degrees Celsius, or about 7% of the total warming. And this is assuming that no carbon tax is put in place. Carbon dioxide emissions from the rest of the world, primarily driven by the rapid growth of emissions in developing countries like China and India, will be responsible for the other 93% of temperature rise, says Paul C. Knappenberger. Our opponent's second contention stated that a carbon tax would benefit the economy. However, we have evidence that proves otherwise, thus being that, quote, without accounting for how the revenues from a carbon tax would be used, such a tax would have a negative effect on the economy. The higher prices it caused would diminish the purchasing power of people's earnings, effectively reducing their real inflation-adjusted wages. Lower real wages would have the net effect of reducing the amount that people worked, thus decreasing the overall supply of labor. Investment would also decline, further reducing the economy's total output, says the Congressional Budget Office. Additionally, quote, a carbon tax would harm the economy, reduce economic growth, and hinder job creation. At the same time, it would not have any noticeable impact on global temperature. That cost is too great for any American, says Thomas Pyle, president of the Institute for Energy Research. Our opponent's third contention stated that a carbon tax would make us independent from foreign oil. They backed up that point by using evidence from one Barack Obama. However, President Obama has already promised to cut the U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases from 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025 by taking advantage of this data from the peer-reviewed Stanford Energy Modeling Forum. One finds that achieving this goal would reduce U.S. GDP between 154 billion and 172 billion dollars a year, says the director of the Copenhagen Census Center. Now I would like to refocus on our own points. Regarding our first contention, I would like to recall the negative impact of a carbon tax, being that the tax will likely cause carbon leakage. Resources for the future quotes, imposing a carbon tax or other policy to reduce emissions in one country can lead to increased emissions elsewhere, a phenomenon known as carbon leakage. This occurs for a variety of reasons. First, the production of some carbon-intensive goods is likely to move abroad to avoid the tax. Second, reduced U.S. demand for fossil fuels will result in lower global prices for those fuels, making them more attractive in unregulated countries. Research finds that, on average, a 10% reduction in carbon emissions in the U.S. would be partially offset by a 1 to 3% increase elsewhere. Moving to our second contention, according to the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, quote, targeting revenues toward people who would be likely to bear a disproportionate burden under a carbon tax would provide them with relief, but such a policy would tend to not reduce the total economic costs of the tax. Thus, lawmakers would face a trade-off between the goals of helping those households hurt by the tax and helping the economy in general, end quote. This evidence proves that a carbon tax would essentially be an economic lose-lose. You either have a floundering working class population or a floundering national economy. Lastly, I would like to bring to light a quote from one Paul C. Knappenberger, Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of Science at the Cato Institute, who says, quote, "The best that any carbon tax in the United States would ever hope to achieve would be to reduce the amount of global warming across the 21st century from about 3 degrees Celsius to about 2.8, and that tiny inconsequential reduction would only occur if all greenhouse gas emissions from the United States were halted forever, starting tomorrow," which isn't the plan. It is for all these reasons that I strongly urge a calm ballot.
Opponents ready?
Yes.
Judge ready? Partner ready? Okay. So I'd like to begin on my opponent's contentions. They began by talking about how a carbon tax will move businesses overseas. But this simply isn't true, because as long as a tax is well designed, it can cut emissions at little or no economic cost. The reason is that the revenue raised by a carbon tax can be used to cut other, more damaging taxes. In general, taxes make economies less efficient, but some do more harm than others. Taxing bads, such as pollution, actually improves the allocation of resources. Now, I would like to go on to my opponent's second contention, that it will have a strong negative effect on the working class. But this simply isn't true, because a carbon tax will likely be accompanied by various rebate schemes to soften the regressive nature of the tax and make it a more progressive tax. One plan calls for the government to auction all emission permits and give each citizen a $700 check each year. Another option is to only give the rebate checks from auction revenues to lower income citizens, thus basically getting rid of the negative impacts. My opponent's third contention is that a carbon tax is not effective. If the goal was simply to reduce global warming pollution, then the British Columbian carbon tax is a perfect example of a tax that does its job. Since its passage, gasoline use in British Columbia has plummeted, declining 7 times as much as might be expected from an equivalent rise in market gas prices. This is extremely significant because it shows the correlation between a carbon tax and emission reduction. Another thing that could strongly impact a local carbon tax on the emissions is a border tax, which would have an effect on a global scale. That's a carbon tax on goods that come from other nations that are created using carbon, essentially. So, by doing that, we actually create a monetary incentive for businesses offshore to have cleaner industries, essentially. Now I would like to move on to our own contentions. So our first contention is that this carbon tax is effective. Our opponents have stated that a unilateral US carbon tax would hurt the domestic economy while doing little to reduce worldwide carbon emissions or levels. This view, however, understates the value of a permanent price signal for research and development and the social and environmental value of emission reductions that would come from US action. Now I'd like to go on to our second contention, its benefit to the economy. A carbon tax would lead to overall economic growth if the tax revenues are used in a way that promotes economic growth, such as cutting other taxes or reducing the deficit. The $125 billion in annual revenues from a $25 per ton carbon tax would allow the federal personal income tax to be reduced by about 15%, or corporate income taxes to be reduced by about 70%, if all carbon tax revenues were used to replace current tax revenues. Now I'd like to go on to our third contention, that it will reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Providers in such countries have seen the tremendous impact of renewable energies can have on their bottom line. Investing in renewable energy can also have a massive impact on the government's expenses. For example, Germany is a major net importer of power. As per estimations by Business Magazine, Germany would be using only renewable energy by the year 2050. If they could achieve that, it would help save them billions of dollars, as they would not have to import energy. So for these reasons, I urge you to adopt the resolution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're continuously stating that as long as the carbon tax is well developed, no one will leave. However, the CBO scenarios concerning the implementation of the tax all include some kind of detrimental impact to at least one part of the economy. And since you can't guarantee that the carbon tax will be somehow implemented beneficially, how could you argue this?
So what you're talking about is that it will have a negative impact on things that use emittance, basically things that like gasoline and fossil fuels. And that makes perfect
No, I'm
sense.
talking
That's
about,
the job of the carbon tax, is to make them change.
Okay, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about the low-income houses who will be detrimentally affected by this, and also the,
Does that take into account any rebates or tax reductions or anything like that?
that takes into account, that's speculation. What you're saying is speculation. How are we to know that there's gonna be rebates or tax reductions?
Well, if we look historically at every other nation that's implemented a carbon tax, they do this.
Okay, and if we look historically at every other nation, the carbon tax isn't effective in most of them.
So what do you mean by most of them?
I'm talking about all of the countries whom a carbon tax has actually,
All of them? Because
Yes,
in
all of
the
the
UK
countries
it's been successful, in Canada it's been successful,
okay, in
Germany it's been successful.
in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, carbon taxes have been in place since the 1990s, but the tax has not yet led to large declines in emission in most of these countries. In the case of Norway, emissions have actually increased by 43% per capita.
What's your
So-
source?
The New York Times.
Okay.
So I'm saying that therefore, you're arguing that this, this carbon tax can be implemented to increase, or to make sure that businesses don't leave and, to do all these things, but that's speculation because
So you
the evidence
understand
proves that in.
that by decreasing the corporate tax by 70%, you understand the impacts that would have on business, right?
No, we're not
So
arguing
if
about
we
the corporate
took-
tax, we're arguing
I
about the carbon
understand, but
tax.
if we took just part of the money that we make off of this, part of the revenue, and we put it into reducing the harmful taxes, the impact that could have on business, that would keep them here.
Okay, but that's speculation because we're not arguing how to implement this tax, and what you're saying, it's not necessarily true. It's not necessarily how the US is gonna adopt this tax. We have no clue how the US is gonna adopt this tax, but looking at the countries that have adopted the tax so far, it's had a negative impact on all their emissions.
Looking at all the countries that have implemented this tax, this is what they do. They all return some of the funds to the people they're taking the money from.
Okay, but it's still, the carbon tax is still
In-
not beneficial to the environment, which
In
is the main
Canada, and
focus of it.
this
It's
comes from the New York
It's
Times.
time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I didn't hear the timer.
Oh, no, it was just kind of
Okay, thank you.
Ready? Partner ready? Judge ready? Our opponents have tried to discredit our contentions, however, they still remain strong. This debate really comes down to two important areas that would be affected by the carbon tax: environment and economy. We have effectively proven that both areas would be harmed by the tax. For the environmental aspect, the goal of a carbon tax would be to curb climate change by diminishing the amount of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. But let's not forget that we are strictly referring to the United States. According to Bjorn Lomborg, director of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, the sum total of CO2 reduction associated with worldwide initiatives proposed at the 2015 Paris Climate Summit would impact global temperatures by 0.17 degrees Celsius. And that accounts for international cooperation. As I mentioned in my first speech, the United States carbon emissions will only be responsible for 7% of this warming. If you do the math, that means that the USA's impact would only be 0.01 degrees Celsius. That's it. As for the economic aspect, the Cato Institute adamantly asserts that the creation of a carbon tax will drive up energy prices, which in turn will drive up prices of all consumer goods. And for the approximately 45 million Americans living below the poverty line, that increased price is crippling. The Institute for Energy Research insists that the tax will reduce economic growth, hinder job creation, and create an inefficient tax code. The Federal Affairs Manager for Americans for Tax Reform even declares that with the economy crawling along at 2 or 3% growth and the unemployment rate stuck around 8%, a carbon tax would only exacerbate our economic hardship. And all of this would be the result of a tax that doesn't even effectively do its job by having no significant environmental impact, as I've proved numerous times. For these reasons and many more, my partner and I strongly urge a con ballot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Judge ready?
Yes.
Opponents ready? Partner ready? So in this debate, we heard 6 contentions, 3 from our opponents and 3 from us. I would like to address my opponent's points, and then, time willing, I would like to move on to mine. My opponent made 3 main arguments. The first was that there are tax evasions that could come from a carbon tax. They said that it would hurt the working class, and they said, lastly, that there would be no significant effect on climate change. Now, the opposing team said that businesses will move businesses overseas, claiming that they'll move where business is cheap. But big oil companies support the carbon tax, and a carbon tax will generate a new market, green energy, encouraging companies to move here. We can also put a border tax that would be incredibly effective, and they haven't refuted that. They've just simply ignored that. Their second main point was that a carbon tax will hurt the working class, but they ignore the fact that a carbon tax can have a dividend and spark a green market and job competition therein. And finally, the opposing team said there would be no significant effect on climate change. And they said that unilateral efforts have not been effective. They said that they brought up the examples of Norway and Australia. But I refuted their first point of Norway with the fact that Norway only taxes 55% of their emissions, and they have rapidly expanded their petroleum industry. In fact, if we look from 1991 to 2003, when they weren't expanding their petroleum industry, they had decreased their emissions by 22%. So none of their contentions are valid under scrutiny. I'd like to move on to my own. As my partner has said many times, there was a significant effect on climate change wherever we look. We can look at Finland, the UK, we can look at Ireland, where emissions have been down 15% since a carbon tax was put in place. We can look at Norway, we can look at Sweden. And anywhere we look at British Columbia, probably the best example. It's a unilateral effort. One little province in Canada has managed to reduce their emissions by 20%. So wherever we look, a carbon tax has been effective, and it can have serious economic benefits. We have demonstrated that a carbon tax could help raise economic revenue that could be spent on a new market, green energy. And our third contention was that it would reduce our dependence on foreign countries. Our opponents said from this contention that it would reduce the GDP by 1%. We have other statistics that say a carbon tax could raise the GDP by 1%. So it would balance itself out. Now, they didn't fully attack the fact that we would reduce our dependence on their countries. And so our contention still stands. For these reasons, we urge you to adopt the resolution.
Thank you. And now we have 2 minutes of final focus.
Crossfire. It's the Grand Cross.
Crossfire. Okay, crossfire, all speakers.
So in your most recent Crossfire, you were talking a lot about corporate tax. So let's continue talking about corporate tax. According to Forbes, Apple moved their official headquarters to Cork, Ireland, so they would only have to pay the 12.5% corporate tax rate, as opposed to the United States' 35% corporate tax rate. So in a sense, that's almost like corporate tax leakage, just like carbon leakage, and this situation can be directly related to
So
what's going
wouldn't
to happen
reducing the
with
corporate tax stop that sort of thing from happening?
For the corporate tax, but not for the carbon tax.
Right, but we could use the revenue from the carbon tax to reduce
But
that.
see, the United States hasn't laid any framework for what's going to happen with a carbon tax. They're saying that
I
they're going
understand that,
to
but
use the revenues of the
because
carbon
this
tax.
policy,
Can you let me finish,
I
please?
understand.
When you're saying that you're going to use all of the revenues to do all these certain things that will help the economy, that's speculation because there is no definite framework for what the U.S. is going to do. And
It's
as
a lot
we
of
know,
ifs. No, you only
Right.
have 95% of all expert economists saying that a carbon tax is the best option.
So we
Real
have to understand,
Source for
it's
that
because this,
oh yeah, so you don't have a source for that?
I have a source for that.
Really, what is
I
it?
don't have it
Okay.
on.
Yeah, that's okay.
so here's the thing, because this policy is still in development, okay? And it is not put together yet in some solid definition.
Right, so you can't use
Policymakers are still looking for the best option.
Right, but it turns out as it is right now, there is no best option when it
And
comes to
because
carbon
of all the
tax.
money we're gonna make out of this tax,
All
we
the
can
money.
do all sorts of things with it, all different manners of things
Okay,
that
but
could
the
benefit
best
our
way to
economy.
look at what we're gonna do with the money is look how all of the other countries have spent their money, and with the way that they're spending their money, it's still not an effective tax.
Oh, by the way, coming back to that, my source is, sorry, it's The Guardian.
Okay, so one of the things you have to understand, in the places where it has been effective, like British Columbia, like in the UK, they do these sort of tax rebates.
And there's also a lot of examples of places where it doesn't work, like
There's actually
Australia
more.
and
No,
Finland.
let's bring up the example of Australia, because
And Norway.
when Australia put its tax in 2012 and it repealed it in 2014, we saw emissions drop by 15 million tons. And after the tax was repealed, we saw emissions rise by 5 million tons.
Well,
in
actually, I'd
4
like to
months.
talk about Australia because after the tax was repealed, they repealed it because there were better alternatives to a carbon tax.
Oh, the alternatives clearly haven't worked because the emissions have shot through the roof, as
Well,
I
there
just said.
the better alternatives haven't been approved yet. Actually, that's why they haven't been seen.
What are the better alternatives?
That's not what this debate is about. It's about whether or not to implement a carbon
if
tax.
there are better alternatives to
I-
a carbon tax, we shouldn't implement it.
I think we're not getting
Right,
over
that's
this.
exactly
I want
the
to talk
point.
about something that you said. You said that this debate is strictly talking about the United States, and then you went on to contradict yourself and say that we will have no global impact. Do you understand that that doesn't work?
Well, no, it does work because the
Climate
United
change is a
States-
global issue, so talking about other nations
But we're only talking
makes
about a
sense in
carbon
this
tax in the
debate.
United States, and
talking-
applying a carbon tax solely in the United States won't have a global impact on the.
It absolutely can.
It absolutely
if
doesn't,
we
as
put
I
a,
proved. The 0.1 degrees Celsius
if we
sounds
put
like
a
a lot
tax
of an
on
impact to you.
goods from outside the United
That's-
States, I understand.
Okay, thank you.
Opponents ready? Partner ready? Judge ready?
We have won this debate because our opponents have failed to successfully refute the following points. Firstly, upon the creation of a carbon tax, large high CO2 emitting corporations would simply and adeptly find a way to avoid paying taxes, as they have done so with other corporate taxes, and raise product prices. Secondly, the economic effects of the tax will wreak havoc on the working class. And lastly, from an environmental standpoint, imposing a carbon tax won't have the significant impact environmentalists are hoping for. I would like to recall 2 statistics that were pivotal to this debate, which our opponents failed to address or successfully invalidate. Firstly, according to a U.S. World Report, quote, pollution leakage will occur when high polluting industries simply move to other countries that don't have a comparable limit on pollution. Leakage can also happen if domestic industries shut down, causing us to import goods from other countries, thus meaning that the U.S. imposing a carbon tax will in turn lead to a wider spread of pollution, especially in countries without regulation, and large companies will be left unaccountable for their carbon footprint. Additionally, the fact that Australia implemented a carbon tax in 2012 only to repeal it 2 years later, in 2014, because as Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott explained, the carbon tax had been, quote, useless and destructive. Useless and destructive. Does that sound like a descriptor of a tax we would like to implement in the United States? Going along with that, I would like to point out the fact that we prosperously refuted their argument that a carbon tax is the most effective tool against climate change. A carbon tax would benefit the economy, and lastly, a carbon tax would make us independent from foreign oil by highlighting the following facts. Firstly, U.S. demand for fossil fuels. Reduced U.S. demand for fossil fuels would result in lower global prices for those fuels, making them more attractive to unregulated countries. Research finds that on average a 10% reduction in carbon emissions in the U.S. would be partially offset by a 1 to 2% increase elsewhere. And lastly, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden had carbon taxes in place since the 1990s, but the tax had not led to a large decline in emissions of these countries. And it is for all of these reasons that my partner and I have highlighted throughout this debate that I strongly urge it on the ballot.
Partner ready? Opponents ready? Judge ready? Okay. So I would like to begin on our contentions. Really, what this debate boils down to is 2 things. As my opponent stated, the environment and the economy. Now, as far as the environment goes, if the goal is to reduce emissions, the tax does its job. We have successfully proven that by looking at other nations that have successfully implemented this tax. To refute this, my opponents have stood beside the argument that the United States can't solve this problem alone. But quite frankly, the United States is a global consumer. We have the power to set a precedent for the world to follow, and we can already see multilateral solutions being discussed. Now I'd like to go on to the second part of this debate, the economy. We have made the benefits to the economy very clear through the ideas such as tax rebates and the reduction of taxes that affect businesses, such as corporate taxes. The only thing that this tax will do is correct a market failure. That is, the pollution of carbon without any repercussions. So, on my opponent's side, they argued that companies will go overseas, but we can keep them here with tax reduction. And with a border tax, as my partner and I have suggested, and also has been suggested by many experts, we can affect businesses offshores and give a monetary incentive to clean up their act for the better good of all humanity. Their second contention is that it'll have a negative impact on the working class. But we can transmit the tax revenue from this tax to them and completely negate the negative impacts of this tax. Their third contention is that it will have no environmental impact. The reduction of emissions will have a benefit to our world. And for this reason, I urge you to adopt the resolution. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for a very vigorous presentation.
Great job. Great job.